The subcommittee will come to order. I want to thank the members of the committee, our witnesses, and those who are in the audience today for taking the time out for appearing before this rare Friday a.m. subcommittee hearing. And the chair now recognizes himself for 5 minutes for opening statements. Crowning a national champion in college football has long been controversial. Whether it has been decided by the AP Sports Writers Poll or by the current Bowl Championship Series, fans of sports talk radio have always argued over which team deserved to be number one. While personally I favor some sort of playoff system to determine a national champion, as does President Obama, I understand and appreciate the history and tradition of the bowl system. However, criticism of the BCS goes beyond just a mere sporting interest in determining the team that most deserves to be national champion. This is indeed about money, and it's about money at taxpayer-funded colleges and universities. College football is big business, and the BCS strikes many critics as unfair from a financial perspective. There are 11 athletic conferences that make up Division I college football. Under the current BCS system, 6 of those conferences, the ACC, the SEC, the Big East, the Big 12, the Big 10, and the Pac-10 are guaranteed $18 million each to distribute among their member schools, while the 5 other non-automatic conferences, the Sun Belt, the WAC, the MAC, Conference USA, and the Mountain West Conference, only receive $9.5 million combined. Notre Dame, an independent school, automatically receives $1.3 million all by itself. How is this fair? How can we justify this system during these tough economic times when states are slashing their budgets and cutting spending on education? And let me be clear that we are not examining a trivial matter at today's hearing. Colleges and universities are funded by taxpayer dollars, and we have to ask whether or not the big, dominant conferences are engaged in uncompetitive behavior and negotiating contracts at the expense of smaller conferences and their schools. In other words, are the big guys getting together and shutting out the little guys? Such disparity in revenue distribution would arguably be justifiable were the schools from the automatic conferences simply better athletically than those from the non-automatic conferences. But for the past year and the past several years, this has clearly not been the case. Let's look at last year. Both the ACC and the Big East failed to produce a single team in the top 10 of the BCS standings, while the Mountain West and the WAC each had a team in the top 10, Utah and Boise State. Yet both the ACC and the Big East received almost $19 million each in BCS revenue, while the Mountain West received only $9.8 million, and the WAC received $3 million. On its face, this does not seem fair or tied to actual performance on the field. Nonetheless, I do want to keep an open mind on this matter and hear from our distinguished panelists today. I'm eager to hear from Commissioner Swofford and Mr. Fox on their views on why the BCS revenue is currently distributed, the way the BCS revenue is currently distributed, why it's fair and equitable to taxpayer-funded colleges and universities. I want this to be a deliberative hearing and a robust exchange of ideas. The BCS recently signed a new television contract with ESPN reportedly worth $125 million a year, starting in 2011. I would be interested to know how the BCS intends to distribute this considerable sum of dollars to colleges and universities across the country. Lastly, I just want to thank my friend, the distinguished ranking member and former chairman of the full committee, Mr. Barton, for his extensive and commendable work on this matter. Mr. Barton has some strong, I might say very strong opinions on this subject, and I appreciate his passion and commitment to exploring this issue among many other issues that this Congress is facing. Mr. Barton has introduced legislation on this issue, legislation that I have co-sponsored, and I sincerely hope that we can discuss this bill as well. And I want to thank all of our witnesses for appearing before us today, and I appreciate your travel to the nation's capital on a relatively short notice. And I yield back the balance of my time, and now I recognize the ranking member of the full committee, my friend from Texas, the one and only Joe Biden.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do have strong opinions. My strongest opinion on this issue is the fact that my team, Texas A&M, is never mentioned in the same breath as national champion for college football, but with Coach Sherman, maybe one of these days that will change. I, along with you, want to welcome our distinguished panel. This is not the Oversight Subcommittee, so we don't subpoena people to testify. You folks all came of your own volition when we asked you to, and we appreciate it. Both those of you who are proponents of a playoff and those of you who have some doubts about it. So we're extremely gratified you'd come on a Friday. When I was chairman of this committee, I held a hearing on the same subject 4 years ago, to just give attention to it. And at that time, in that hearing, I had hoped that through a spirit of volunteerism that the BCS would decide to go to a playoff system. That hasn't happened yet. It's interesting that people of goodwill, and I think everybody on whatever side of the issue you are on this one is a person of goodwill, keep trying to tinker with the current system, and it's to my mind a little bit like, and I don't mean this directly, but it's like communism. You can't fix it. It will not be fixable. Sooner or later, you're going to have to try a new model, and that's why we're here today. We've heard about the thrill of victory and the agony of defeat on ABC Wide World of Sports, but as Mr. Rush says, sports fans seldom think about the money. We're going to talk about the money a little bit today. Chairman Rush mentioned it in his opening statement, and it is, I think, an important reason why we do not have a playoff system. Last year, the so-called championship game had two teams that had each lost a game, but there were several other teams that had only lost one game, and there was a team that hadn't lost any games, Utah, that wasn't in the national championship game. If you had a playoff system, you wouldn't have that problem. The people in the playoff game, the championship game, would be there because they've beaten everybody else. No system is perfect, but why is it in the NCAA, every other sport, they give a championship, it's won on the field, or on the track, or in the golf course, or in the gymnasium. It's not won because two teams are kind of picked out of a hat, or as a result of a poll and a computer system, and allowed to play for the national championship. Several college coaches that are well known have said that they're advocates for a playoff system. Bleymaier, who's the head coach of the current national championship team, Florida, has stated in the past that he favors a playoff. Nick Saban, Pete Carroll, the head coach at Texas, Mack Brown. In May of 2008, one of the winningest college football coaches of all time, Joe Paterno, said, and I quote, "I think you ought to win it on the field. I've always been for a playoff," end quote. We didn't ask the coaches of Boise State or Utah to be here today, but if they were here and testifying, I think they would say they were for a playoff. There are countless coaches, even a few university presidents, and believe it or not, the president, President Obama, who have stated that they think we need to have a playoff, the same as we have in every other sport. The more I think about it, the more people I talk to who really know college football, it's clearer and clearer to me that the reason we don't have a playoff system is a very green reason. It's not green environmentally, it's green money. It's that simple. As Chairman Rush has said, $125 million television contract, and all the other contracts that are not through nationally but through regionally. It's just too much money being made this way, and people don't want to change that. This is interstate commerce. This committee has every right to regulate interstate commerce. The bill that I've introduced, that Chairman Rush is a co-sponsor of, doesn't say there has to be a playoff. It simply says if you're going to advertise it as a national championship series and a national championship game, it has to be the result of a playoff. Otherwise, it's a false and deceptive trade practice under the Federal Trade Act. So you couldn't advertise. You couldn't get the money. You couldn't sell the T-shirts. You couldn't do all those things that you do under the current system. So it's not Congress being dictatorial. It's Congress saying truth in advertising. If we're going to have a national championship game, a national championship team, it ought to be the result of a playoff. I think equity is a factor here, too. My guess is when Mr. Swofford and Mr. Fox talk later, they're going to talk about the student athlete, as well they should. But it's interesting to me that we've just added another regular season game. I don't see how that helps academics. And we're also playing college football on Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays. Those are not normal evenings that our student athletes should be out on the football field. They should be in study hall or something like that. The reason that they're playing Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays is not because they're making straight A's in classes, although some of them may be. It's because their schools need the extra money, and their coaches are hopeful that the extra exposure, especially if they're from a non-BCS conference, might get a little bump in the polls and move up so that they might have a shot at one of the at-large bids in the BCS. Some movement has been made. I'm told that there was some discussion at the last BCS meeting, whenever that was, about a playoff, but that it was rejected. I think that's a step in the right direction. They're talking about it, but the real step is to go ahead and implement it. I don't buy the argument that you can't change because of television contracts. Those contracts have kick-out clauses. It'd be very easy to implement a playoff system. I also don't buy the argument, although I'm going to listen closely to Mr. Fox from the Alamo Bowl, that it would somehow destroy the bowl system or the mid-range bowls or things like this. They could be a part of the playoff system. They could be in addition to the playoff system. The NIT basketball tournament has thrived in the midst of a 65-team playoff for the college basketball championship. As I asked Mr. Fox off camera, if Texas A&M and Texas Tech were in a playoff and the first round was at the Alamo Bowl, I think the Alamo Bowl would do pretty well. So In any event, Mr. Chairman, I see my time is way over expired. I am for college football. I enjoy watching it. I enjoy going to the games in person. I have a wife who's a fanatic, University of Texas Longhorn fan. She had season tickets at Texas. So it makes some interesting Thanksgivings when A&M and Texas are playing in my home. I've had ham sandwiches on the back porch as much as I've had hot turkey in the dining room some of these last few years. But I hope we can work this out. And again, thank you for holding the hearing, and you gentlemen, thank you for testifying. You're at least you're willing to go on the record, and as I told some of you privately, there's a whole bunch of heated intensity off the record, but there's not nearly as many people willing to go on the record, so we appreciate you being here. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The chair thanks the ranking member, and now the chair recognizes my friend, my classmate, the congressman from Texas, Mr. Green, for 5 minutes of an opening statement. And prior to that, the chairman sees that the gentleman has a helmet. I don't know if are we going to engage in any kind of combat here on the hearing, or that's just a...
Mr. Chairman, that violates House rules, but I'm not going to object.
Mr. Chairman, I have a blue-collar district. We normally wear hard hats, just not this hard.
Okay, all right. Well, the chair recognizes the gentleman for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you for holding the hearing on this. And just for the public's interest, our Energy and Commerce Committee has been spending weeks and actually months now working on carbon sequestration and health care. And this is a much more fun to talk about. Because I'm actually here today, even though Congress is not, because I thought we were going to have some work on our energy work, and coming from Houston, Texas, that's awfully important in our community. But I'm glad that the chair of our subcommittee held the hearing and on Bowl Championship Series and NCAA Division I college football. I want to thank our witnesses, like my colleagues did, for traveling across the country. The problem you have two Texans here and only one fellow from Chicago. So you're going to have to listen to a lot of UT, A&M, and in this case, University of Houston, because I know you traveled from across the country. Over the last several seasons, there's been growing frustration with the system and less than unanimous agreement on the teams that should be playing Bowl Championship Series national title game. The most recent title game this January is no exception. There was hardly agreement from professional commentators and fans alike that Oklahoma and Florida were the two best teams in the country. Now, I'm an alumnus of the University of Houston, and while it's been a while since the Cougars were at the top of the polls, my family's divided because my son went to Texas A&M, my daughter went to the University of Texas, and as we know that UT beat Oklahoma earlier in the year in the Red River Shootout, and many people thought they were a better team to contend for the national title. There were also two undefeated teams, Utah and Boise State, that were established themselves as top caliber teams over the recent years with bowl wins over larger schools and impressive regular season records, despite coming from conferences that do not receive an automatic bid into a BCS bowl game. The coalition conferences that do not receive an automatic bid to a BCS bowl game also receive significantly less money from BCS generated revenue, approximately half of the $18 million the automatic BCS conferees receive. While the coalition conference does receive a larger share if they place a team in the BCS bowl, the odds are so highly stacked against them as we saw last year with Utah and Boise State, they rarely have that opportunity. Last season, my alma mater, the University of Houston, actually won its first bowl game since 1980 when it defeated Air Force in the Armed Forces Bowl. If the Cougars program gets back to where it was in the late 70s, and when they finished fourth in the AP and coaches poll in 76 and fifth in 1979, I would hope they would have the opportunity to compete in the BCS Bowl. But with recent history has shown that under the BCS systems, odds are not in their favor since they are a coalition conference. Mr. Chairman, I thank you for holding the hearing and look forward to the fairness of the BCS system. I know our witnesses today are a number of different viewpoints on the issue, and I look forward to the testimony. In the sports pages and the college towns across the country, there is growing frustration that current system is significantly flawed, and I'm pleased Craig Thompson is here today because I've read several articles last week in the Houston Chronicle about your presentation of BCS and suggested changes. And while I understand may be still under consideration. And again, thank you for being here, and and appreciate the time today. But again, for the mass public who's worried about carbon and healthcare, we're working on those, but we can walk and chew gum at the same time.
The chair thanks the gentleman, and now the chair is indeed gratified to welcome our witnesses before this panel. Again, I want to reiterate our deep appreciation for you taking the time out from your very busy schedules to appear before this subcommittee. And I just want to assure you that this subcommittee, this chairman, and I believe that the members of Congress, the overwhelming majority of members of Congress, have a keen interest in this particular issue, and that this interest will will give us an opportunity to have some meaningful discussions and debate around this particular issue as we go forward. Before I swear you in, I just want to say that about a week ago I read in the USA Today a comment that was pretty derisive of the congressional involvement, the legislative involvement on this particular issue. And I can't remember the author of this statement, the gentleman that the statement was attributed to, but I can assure you, each and every one of you, that he was dead bang wrong. We are quite interested in it, keenly interested in it. Some indeed are very passionate about it, and I don't see, it's not in the interest of college football for anyone to be dismissive of our congressional intent, responsibility, and our congressional commitment. So with that said, I'm going to welcome our witnesses, and I would ask you, because it's been a new practice of this subcommittee to swear in witnesses, so I would ask you to stand and please raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Please let the record reflect that all witnesses have answered in the affirmative. Please take your seat. The chair now recognizes himself. Oh, I'm
We're willing to listen to you
right.
again, Mr. Chairman.
No, that's well, all right. That's all right. Let the witnesses. Now the chair recognizes our witnesses, and I'll introduce them first before we hear their opening statements. To my left, to your right, is Mr. John D. Swofford, who is the current commissioner of the Athletic Coast Conference. Next to Mr. Wofford is Mr. Craig Thompson, who's the commissioner of the West Mountain Conference. And next to Mr. Thompson is Mr. Derrick Fox, who is the president and CEO of the Alamo Bowl, representing the Football Bowl Alliance. And lastly, next to Mr. Fox is one Mr. Gene Bleymaier, who is the athletic director of Boise State University. Again, welcome each and every one of you. Mr. Swofford will begin with you for 5 minutes of opening statements or thereabouts. Please pull the mic to you and turn it on, and you're not recognized.
Excuse me. Thank you, sir. Mr. Chairman, members of the subcommittee, Ranking Member Barton, ladies and gentlemen. My name is John Swofford, and I've been commissioner of the Atlantic Coast Conference since 1997. Prior to that, I was the athletic director at the University of North Carolina, my alma mater, for 17 years. I speak to you today not only as someone who has been fortunate to spend my entire professional career as an athletic administrator, but also as a former student athlete in the sport of football. While I was in college, I was fortunate to play at UNC and participate in 2 postseason bowl games. Like most student athletes, my football career ended when I received my undergraduate degree. My own experiences in the Peach Bowl and Gator Bowl remain among the fondest memories of my athletic career. As an administrator, I have tried to ensure that those same postseason opportunities exist for as many student athletes as possible. Currently, the Atlantic Coast Conference serves as the coordinating offices for the Bowl Championship Series. This is an assignment that rotates every 2 years among the conferences that are a part of the BCS arrangement. The BCS is now 11 years old, and it is the result of a group of people at the various conferences and selected bowls asking one question: how can we keep the bowl system and also create a championship game that includes the number 1 and number 2 ranked teams on an annual basis? Prior to the current BCS structure, the 2 top-rated teams played each other only 9 times in 45 years. The BCS exists to accomplish 3 relatively simple goals. 1, create the opportunity for a national championship game. 2, maintain the bowl structure and create quality matchups. And number 3, maintain and enhance college football's regular season as the best and most meaningful in all of college sports. The BCS has been successful in reaching these 3 goals. It has paired the number 1 and number 2 ranked teams in the nation on an annual basis. It now includes all 11 of the Football Bowl subdivision conferences. Every conference has more access into the highest level of bowl games, more money, and access potentially into the national championship game than ever before. During the BCS 11-year span, college football has flourished. Attendance is soaring, television ratings are high. BCS television ratings regularly outrate the NCAA basketball Final Four, the NBA playoff finals, and the World Series. Recently, the level of interest of young people in various sports was measured. NASCAR and the NFL over the last decade gained 1%. College football gained 9% in the 12 to 17 age group, the largest gain of any sport. Most every other sport has actually devalued the regular season, while college football's regular season has only gained in stature, interest, attendance, and television coverage. While realizing that many American sports fans relate very well to a playoff system, much of this could be lost if the regular season were turned into a seeding process. The current system maintains long-term bowl alliances. Bowls have existed for over 90 years in some cases, starting with the Rose Bowl. They stand as cultural icons in our country. 29 non-BCS bowls create regional interests, support charitable causes, generate tourism, economic impact, and tax dollars for host cities, as well as give approximately 6,000 young men, most of whom are not fortunate enough to play on college championship teams, the chance to enjoy a memorable postseason experience. Bowls are not merely games. They're events. Teams do not travel to them the day before the game and leave immediately afterward, as in the regular season or would be the case in a playoff. Rather, they go to the host city and stay as many as 6 days, enjoying the hospitality of the bowl organization. Fans travel to the games and stay for several days, thus generating economic benefits for the host city and allowing the bowl to attract local sponsors and support that help it fulfill its economic and charitable missions. For example, the Sugar Bowl estimates that the 2 BCS bowl games played in January 2008 created an economic impact in the city of New Orleans and the state of Louisiana of nearly $400 million. State and local governments realized nearly $25 million in tax revenues as a result of those 2 games. We cannot reasonably expect fans and teams to travel multiple times in December or January, staying several days in each location. Our fans do not have the time, and most do not have the financial resources to do so. Moreover, I am not aware of any football playoff in this country at any level in which all games are played at predetermined neutral sites that may be thousands of miles from the homes of the participating teams. College football is different than professional. There are 120 bowl subdivision college football teams, and our preference is that a system provide a large number of those teams with a postseason opportunity. Professional football, with only 32 teams, can make a 12-team playoff work nicely within its structure. Like all other football playoffs in the NCAA and the professional leagues, early round games of any bowl subdivision playoff would almost certainly be played at campus sites, with only the final contest at a neutral site. As the playoff grows, sponsorship and television revenues that historically have flowed into bowl games and their host cities will inevitably follow, meaning that it will be very difficult for any bowl, including the current BCS bowls, which are among the oldest and most established in the game's history, to survive. The current system also keeps football a one-semester sport, maintains the integrity of the regular season, preserves the overall bowl system, does not conflict with fall semester exams in most instances, and adds only one additional game. One of the reasons we are where we are in postseason college football is because of the fact that the BCS is a system that the conferences have individually and collectively been able to agree on. Decisions concerning the BCS arrangement are made by a presidential oversight committee, which is a group of university presidents and chancellors, with advice from conference commissioners, athletic directors, and coaches. The BCS arrangement is reviewed annually by all 11 conference commissioners and an athletic director's advisory panel. We also seek the advice of representatives of the American Football Coaches Association on certain matters. Ultimately, our presidents and chancellors remain strongly committed to the balance of academic and athletic excellence. Their first priority is their students and preparing them for their futures. The BCS, we find, is fully consistent with the educational mission of our colleges and universities and maximizes the number of postseason opportunities for our student athletes, coaches, and fans. Now, each year, one or more of the conferences submits ideas for change in the current system. All of them receive careful and deliberate consideration. Last year, for example, the Atlantic Coast Conference and the Southeastern Conference proposed a format adjustment. This year, the Mountain West has suggested a different adjustment in the format, and the conferences will consider that proposal during their various upcoming spring meetings.
Mr. Swofford, you're almost 4 minutes over, but I've been so would you bring your comments to a close, please?
Thank you, sir. We're aware that no mechanism for determining a college football national champion will ever be perfect without controversy or without ambiguity. We're always open to suggestions to improve the BCS or the game of college football as a whole. In closing, college football continues to be managed within the context of higher education. University presidents and chancellors seek a balance between the academic missions of their institutions and the desire of fans for a system to crown a national champion. We want to maintain the significance of the regular season and support a vibrant postseason bowl structure that provides a maximum number of opportunities for student athletes. Mr. Chairman, I have a letter from a number of conferences, presidents, and the University of Notre Dame that I would like to submit for the record, please.
So ordered.
Again, thank you for the opportunity to be with you today and to address these matters.
The chair now recognizes Mr. Thompson for 5 minutes or thereabouts.
Thank you, Chairman Rush, Ranking Member Barton, and members of the subcommittee for holding this important hearing. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today. The presidents of our 9-member institutions believe there are 5 fundamental flaws with the current BCS system. They also feel criticism without a solution solves nothing. Therefore, the Mountain West Conference has submitted a proposal known as the BCS Reform Proposal, which addresses each of these flaws. First, BCS revenue distribution is grossly inequitable. There are 6 automatic qualifying conferences known as AQ conferences, whose champions are guaranteed access to lucrative BCS bowl games each year, regardless of how they perform on the field. These conferences receive more than 87% of the revenue from the BCS, whereas the other 5 conferences, called non-automatic qualifying conferences, collectively receive under 13%. Under the current system, conferences that perform in a similar manner are not treated the same. The Mountain West has performed well against the 6 automatic qualifying conferences in interconference games over the past 4 years. Yet during that same span, the BCS has paid each of these 6 conferences an average of $78 million in revenue, while we received just $18 million. To illustrate the point, in 2008, the Mountain West and an AQ conference each had 1 team play in a BCS Bowl. We had 3 teams ranked in the top 16, all of whom finished above that conference's champion. Yet the AQ conference still received almost $9 million more from the BCS for that year. If the revenue was more fairly distributed, non-automatic qualifying universities could use the additional funds to improve academic programs, increase scholarships, increase medical support for student athletes, and pursue a host of other beneficial purposes. The reform proposal would also result in considerable new revenue for all conferences so that all universities would benefit financially. In this economic climate, that is extremely important. Second, the BCS relies on non-performance-based standards to determine which conferences are guaranteed access. Specifically, the BCS uses bowl tie-ins and agreements to determine which conferences automatically qualify. Pre-arranged agreements trump results on the field. The reform proposal ensures that performance is the primary factor in determining which conference champions automatically qualify for the high-profile BCS Bowls. Under the proposal, a conference has to win at least 40% of its interconference games against AQ conferences over a 2-year period to earn an automatic bid. Third, none of the 51 teams that play in non-AQ conferences can realistically ever have the opportunity to win a BCS national championship, given how the current system is constituted. Such a result is patently unfair. Again, in 2008, the Mountain West had the best interconference record against AQ conference teams, and Utah had the best record in major college football. However, those student athletes did not have an opportunity to compete for the national championship. Utah was eliminated this past season not by a team but by the BCS system. The BCS incorrectly presumes that computers and pollsters can look at several outstanding teams and somehow determine which 2 deserve to play in a national championship game. To remedy this flaw, the reform proposal creates an 8-team playoff. This will not only produce substantial new revenue, but it will also make the regular season and postseason much more exciting. Many more regular season games will impact the national championship race under this proposal, and the number of postseason games with title implications will also increase exponentially. The playoff would only add about a week and a half to the season during the winter break, and then only for 2 teams. Fourth, the BCS relies on confusing computer formulas and pollsters to decide the BCS rankings. The reform proposal would use a well-informed committee like the committee in college basketball to make these important determinations. Fifth, the BCS dictates unbalanced representation on its governing body. The reform proposal would permit each conference and Notre Dame to have exactly 1 vote. Our presidents believe that by remedying these 5 flaws, the BCS reform proposal helps to ensure higher education is sending the appropriate messages to students and is acting above reproach. One of the primary objectives of universities is to ensure students graduate with a firm understanding of the principles of fundamental fairness and equitable treatment. Yet support of the current BCS system is not consistent with those principles. It is consistent with the message that if you work hard, you have a chance to reach any goal. That's simply not true under the current BCS format. Given the system's fundamental flaws, it is time for the BCS to act. It should join President Obama, Vice President Biden, and members of Congress from both parties in acknowledging the need for change and take the appropriate steps now to develop a more equitable system. Thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to answering questions.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. The chair now recognizes Mr. Fox for 5 minutes or thereabouts for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, members of the subcommittee, and Ranking Member Barton, my name is Derrick Fox. I'm the former chairman and currently at-large member of the Football Bowl Association. I am also president and CEO of the Valero Alamo Bowl in San Antonio, Texas. I'm here today representing the members of the Football Bowl Association, a group that includes all 34 postseason bowl games, from the members of the BCS to the smallest of the postseason events. These games are played in 29 different communities. Our association has been in existence for more than a quarter century, and we've grown as the number of bowl games has grown. My purpose in appearing here today is to tell you that the current bowl system, for whatever flaws it may have, is more than just alive and kicking. But also, it is to say that if the net result of your efforts is to create a playoff, we believe you will, by substituting games for events, cause the demise of the bowl system. My prepared statement details the current postseason structure, the benefits to the institutions, and the benefits to the players and their fans. But I'd like to stress to you the benefits enjoyed by the communities where these games are played. What does it mean to the 29 communities where the games are held? For one thing, since almost all the postseason bowl games are put on by charitable groups, with up to 1/4 of the proceeds from the games are dedicated to the community, local charities receive tens of millions of dollars every year. Excluding television and print exposure these communities receive, it has been estimated that the bowl games will generate in excess of $1 billion in annual economic impact. As I said before, we don't put on games, we put on events. Fans make the bowl experience a holiday experience, spending up to a week in the community, supporting pre- and post-Christmas businesses in hotels, restaurants, and visitor attractions. Moreover, the title sponsor or presenting sponsors of a bowl game frequently is a commercial institution headquartered in the host city, whose integration into the community and vice versa is enhanced by the bowl game itself. It is our firm belief that if a playoff is created, the television dollars in the postseason will flow to that playoff. Likewise, the sponsorship dollars. And when that happens, the mid-tier bowls, and most assuredly the smaller bowls, will simply go out of business. Those who don't like the current system will say, well, that's the way of the world. But we don't believe that government should have any role in promoting the demise of the bowl games. Let me address a situation I'm quite familiar with, being the president and CEO of the Valero Alamo Bowl in San Antonio. Periodically, we have conducted an economic and fiscal impact analysis for our event. The most recent study was done 14 months ago between Penn State and Texas A&M. This was not some back-of-the-envelope estimate, but rather a 30-page intensive analysis performed by a combined efforts of two respected sets of economists, Sports Strategic Marketing Services of Memphis, Tennessee, and Sports Economics of Oakland, California. They concluded that there were more than 55,000 incremental visitors coming to San Antonio for the game, who spent an average of just over $740 during their stay. They stayed on average for 3.8 days, spending $195 a day, plus an additional $142 on tickets and other costs in the dome. These visitors included not only the fans of the competing schools, but the teams themselves and a full contingent of media covering the event. Their expenditures included lodging, food and beverage, transportation, rental cars, retail, and entertainment. According to the study, the direct economic impact of the city of San Antonio was $42.6 million. The total economic impact of the city of San Antonio, including the recognized multiplier, was $73.7 million. And the incremental tax impact of the city of San Antonio, i.e. taxes collected as a result of the event's operations and non-local visitors traveling to that city, would not have accrued to the region if it were not for the presence of the event being measured, was $2.7 million. Why do I cite all this? The reason is simple. We don't simply put on a game, we put on an event that runs the better part of a week. It involves not only the game itself, but a kickoff luncheon, a team fiesta, a pep rally, great party, golf tournament, FCA breakfast, team days at SeaWorld, Alamo visit, hospital visits, you name it. It's an entire week's package for the student athletes and their fans. Create a playoff, and if the postseason games do not evolve to home games on college campuses, you will create a one-day in-and-out experience, if that, to replace the current bowl system. The proponents of a playoff system simply do not understand the economics of the current system as one of events, not just games. No system is perfect. The bowls are not perfect, and the Bowl Championship Series is not perfect. But certainly the concept of a playoff, as attractive as it may sound from the experts on sports talk radio, is rife with dangers for a system that has served collegiate athletics pretty well for 100 years. It's easy to express support of a playoff concept, which has never been tested. All of your assumptions and theories work out perfectly. With the current structure of the bowl games, you protect the importance of the college football regular season, and as importantly, you have 29 communities committed to providing not just the financial support, but a quality experience for the thousands of players and fans who attend each bowl game. The current bowl system does reward over 6,800 student athletes, creates more than $1 billion in annual combined economic impact to the host cities, donates $250 million annually to higher education, and gives millions to charitable endeavors in their own communities. Quite simply, it's a system that works well, benefits many, and ought not to be under attack. Mr. Chairman, I'd like as well to submit a copy of a letter from the Association of Members of Congress dealing with this subject. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today.
Without hearing no objections, the letter will be entered into the record.
Mm-hmm.
I want to thank you, Mr. Fox. Our next witness is Mr. Bleymaier. Mr. Bleymaier, you are recognized for 5 minutes for the purposes of opening statements. Take as much time as you may consume.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Chairman Rush, and members of the subcommittee, and Ranking Member Barton. My name is Gene Bleymaier. I am the athletic director at Boise State University, and I also founded the Humanitarian Bowl in Boise, Idaho 12 years ago, and am currently on the board of directors of the bowl game. The issues I would like to address with you today are the following. First, competitiveness. And I would refer you to the handout that you received in your information packet. Boise State's football team is the winningest program in the country over the past 10 years, with a winning percentage of 84.3% and an overall record of 108 wins against 20 losses. In the past 10 years, Boise State football has the nation's best conference winning percentage at over 93%, 70 wins and 5 losses, and also the nation's best home winning percentage at 97%, 64 wins and 2 losses. In the past 5 years, Boise State has finished the regular season undefeated 3 times, in 2004, 06, and 08. Boise State's football record ranks number 8 overall all-time in the country. The team has won over 70% of its games. Our success is not recent, but spans nearly 80 years. Boise State is also one of the most nationally televised teams in the country, with no fewer than 4 games televised nationally each of the past 6 years. 33 times in those years, Boise State has been on national television, and we are scheduled to be on national television 7 times again this fall. Nearly 6 national telecasts per year. In 2004, Boise State went undefeated and finished the season ranked 9th in the BCS rankings. Boise State did not get invited to the BCS. However, Michigan, ranked 13th, and Pittsburgh, ranked 21st, did get invited. In 2006, Boise State again went undefeated and finished the season ranked 8th in the BCS rankings, and was invited to the Fiesta Bowl to play the University of Oklahoma. Boise State defeated Oklahoma in one of the greatest games ever played. In 2008, Boise State again went undefeated and finished the season ranked 9th in the BCS rankings. While Boise State did not get invited to the BCS again, Ohio State ranked 10th, Cincinnati ranked 12th, and Virginia Tech, ranked 19th, did. 3 times in the past 5 years, Boise State has won all of its games in the current BCS system, never came close to playing in the national championship game. The BCS system not only restricts access, but essentially precludes schools from playing in the national championship. How many more years do we need to go undefeated before we get a chance? We believe the BCS system is exclusionary and limits access to BCS bowls to the benefit of automatic qualifying conferences and to the detriment of non-automatic qualifying conferences. The automatic qualifying criteria bestowed on the 6 automatic qualifying conferences, in our opinion, should be adjusted, altered, or eliminated. Third is revenue distribution. The BCS revenue distribution formula and automatic qualifying criteria is heavily weighted toward rewarding the AQ conferences and not rewarding the non-AQ conferences. The automatic qualifying conferences receive approximately 90% of the BCS revenues unless a non-AQ conference school, which encompasses 51 schools, qualifies for a BCS game. Annually, non-AQ conferences are only guaranteed a little over 9% of the total revenue to split among 51 institutions. The last point is governance. The BCS does not afford conferences equitable representation on the BCS Presidential Oversight Committee, which is the body that governs the BCS. The automatic qualifying conferences, the six, receive 6 votes. Notre Dame receives 1 vote. The non-qualifying conferences, 5 conferences, 51 schools, receive a total of 1 vote. 65 schools get 6 votes, 51 schools get 1 vote, and 1 school gets 1 vote. This voting distribution is unfair, inequitable, and totally unmanageable. One president cannot adequately represent 51 institutions in 5 different conferences. The NCAA sponsors 88 championships in almost every sport, but they do not sponsor the biggest one, the championship of the Football Bowl subdivision, formerly Division 1A. We believe there is a lot of revenue being left on the table without having the NCAA run this championship. The 6 automatic qualifying conference commissioners and the athletic director at Notre Dame control the BCS and the national championship for major college football. This group has devised a system that gives them approximately 90% of the proceeds and essentially excludes over 50 institutions from playing for the national championship. The BCS system, in our opinion, needs to be more equitable financially, more accessible, and provide more institutions with fair representation. Thank you for the opportunity to share these concerns with you today.
The chair thanks the gentleman and thanks all the witnesses. Now, the chair recognizes himself for as much time as he may consume for the purpose of asking questions of these witnesses. Let me begin by stating I really want to spend some time on this matter of revenue and revenue distribution. According to the BCS Media Guide, in the year 2008, $18 million automatically went to each of the 6 automatic conferences. I think this has been stated earlier. If one of these conferences had 2 teams in a BCS Bowl, then that conference received an additional $4.5 million. By contrast, the 5 other non-automatic conferences automatically received in the aggregate a total of $9.5 million, plus an extra $9.5 million because the Mountain West, for example, was in the Sugar Bowl. As such, each non-automatic conference received approximately $3.8 million in PCS revenue for their member schools. Notre Dame, as was stated earlier, which is an independent school, automatically received $1.3 million and qualifies for another $4.5 million all by itself if it's in a BCS game. The question that I like to ask these members of the panel, and you can be very brief in the answers, I want to ask each and every one of you, can you comment on the fairness of the revenue distribution under the scenario that I just outlined? How is that fair? Starting with Mr. Swofford.
Mr. Chairman, I think one has to go back to the beginnings of the BCS to understand the financial distribution. The BCS is totally voluntary. If any conferences don't want to be a part of it, they can opt out at any time. In order to come to a conclusion and a system that the conferences could agree upon and move forward with, we had to take into account what the various conferences were making in their current contractual agreements at the time the BCS was started. And at that point in time, you had the Rose Bowl with the Big Ten and Pac-10, the Fiesta Bowl with the Big 12, the Sugar Bowl with the Southeastern Conference, and an offer on the table with the Blockbuster Bowl for the Atlantic Coast Conference in the Big East to receive equivalent dollars to any of those aforementioned bowls. Then the Orange Bowl wanted to connect with the Atlantic Coast Conference and the Big East. So at the beginning, as host institutions. So at the beginning, you had the 6 conferences that currently have automatic qualification receiving significant dollars because of their ability, marketplace, and the history of the competitiveness within those leagues and the performance of those leagues that tied into the major bowls. So I think that is what set the bar in terms of where we were. It also set the bar in a sense in terms of the other conferences that are a part of the BCS. And the 11 conferences, and all of the conferences talked through this and agreed upon it, and any changes that have been made in it since that point in time, the same thing has been true. The conferences have agreed upon it. It's been thoroughly discussed, and in terms of what the distribution would be, in terms of what what you would need to do as a conference to be an automatic qualifier in the BCS, and agreed upon.
I certainly appreciate the history, but it didn't answer the question. Is this the way that these revenues are distributed? Where's the fairness? Is this a fair way?
Well, I think a lot of fairness a lot of times is from where you sit. I understand that, but right. I think it is fair because it represents the marketplace, and the BCS and bowls and postseason football are related to the marketplace. And I think you have to look at if the conferences did away with the BCS, and that could happen if the appropriate and right conferences, so to speak.
I don't want to dominate time. Thank you so much. I want to move to the next witness. Mr. Thompson, is this a fair way to distribute the revenues?
I would agree with Commissioner Swofford that basically these tie-ins are based on marketplace, past history, and contractual arrangements. Our position is they should be based more on performance basis, and that perhaps each conference receives a particular base level, and then every first placement by each conference receives an equal distribution. And if you have a second team, certainly that warrants an additional stipend, but that the fairness would be that if you play in a game, that each of those first participants have equal distribution.
Thank you. Mr. Fox, would you care to answer this? No, I recognize Mr. Fox right now. Would you please answer the question?
Sure. Obviously, from our perspective, we're not a member of the BCS. We're not part of the system itself, but obviously part of the bowl system. And that, too, is predicated on the marketplace, drives the dynamics. We have conference agreements with the Big 10 and Big 12, respectively, and we come to a market-based decision as to what our team payout will be. So, it goes through the entire system, not just at the BCS level. So, I really defer to Commissioner Swofford.
Mr. Bleymaier, would you take a shot at that question, please?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. I would agree that at the origin, these were bowl-based contracts with conferences. But now that the system has changed, and now that we have the BCS rankings and the formula and 10 slots, it's a whole different market. It's a whole different model. And I think it would not hurt the bowls at all financially and help the schools if this was more performance-based. And you take the top 10 based on the BCS rankings and reward them with opportunities to play in those BCS games and then distribute the revenues accordingly.
Yeah, let me just remind all the witnesses, I understand that you have market-based considerations that you should take into account when you're making certain decisions. But you can't forget that the basic foundations for all of these universities, all these participating programs, are the federal and state tax dollars that go into these schools. And right now, most of these schools all of these schools are experiencing financial crises simply because of the fact that they have to cut back on their budgets, and so marketplace considerations are one thing, but you can't obviate or just can't deny and erase the fact that there is a determinant for equitable treatment simply because you're using federal tax dollars for your basic existence. All of these universities are, and given that the states are imposing steep educational cuts to public universities funded by taxpayer dollars, is there a role for the Congress? Should Congress intervene? I'll start with you, Mr. Swofford, and you can start. Should Congress intervene in this matter?
Well, I think all of us involved with this welcome input from Congress or anywhere else that can help us improve the system. It's not a perfect system. We understand that. It is a system that has been able to bring the conferences together. And if the conferences determine that it's a system they don't want to be a part of, then the BCS structure unravels at that point, and the conferences that would be, I don't think the major conferences are going to be a part of a system that brings their market value down rather than where they know it could be on an individual basis. So the beauty of what we have and the necessity of what we have is that it has been something that can bring the conferences together. I think the conferences without automatic qualification have been enhanced with the BCS during this 11-year period, both financially as well as with the opportunities to play in the various BCS bowls that have been mentioned. I think.
Thank you, Mr. Swofford. Mr. Thompson, would you?
Simply, certainly our university presidents, myself, we work for and with the representatives of the people, the fans. Every poll that I have seen indicates a strong desire for a different format, a playoff format, and simply looking at the whole process, I feel part of our fundamental flaw issue is the representation. With one president representing 51 institutions, it's very difficult to filter that message down or to have a very loud voice. Might be outvoted. It might be a unanimous opposite position.
But does the Congress, the U.S. Congress, have a role in this matter?
The U.S. Congress have a role. I think that as the U.S. Congress, again, represents fans, constituencies, and our university presidents work with that same group of constituency.
Mr. Fox?
Yes, Mr. Congressman. I think one of the things that's important to stress here is taking a look at the entire system and how it has evolved over the 90 years. And there's always been communication, there's been dialogue. The things have transpired and evolved. I mean, we had the Alliance, the Coalition, the BCS. So you can see over time how things have evolved. And it has been a constant work in progress to try to take care of all the different constituents that are a part of this. But at the end of the day, it is a system that has worked for 90 years. And as I said, $250 million going back to higher education this year, that's a pretty successful benchmark. And each year it goes up. In this current BCS system, we were here 4 years ago, there were 28 bowl games. There's now 34. So that's also allowed additional opportunities for teams in the marketplace as well. And those dollars are going back to higher education too.
So your answer to the question is, does Congress, is yes or no? Does Congress have a role or Congress doesn't have a role?
I think the people who have a vested interest in the business are the people, within the system, and they probably are best issued to deal with the system.
So your answer is no, Congress doesn't have a role.
It's your choice, sir.
Okay. Mr. Bleymaier?
Chairman Rush, I would think if you look at the history of the development of the BCS and where we got to today, it has evolved over time. It's never been a perfect system, and it has changed. But if you look, a lot of times, historically, that change has only come with hearings like we're having today. And unfortunately, with the threat of lawsuits, it would be better for all served if the conferences could agree on a plan and a formula and approve it themselves. But because of the representation disparity that we have, that is virtually impossible, in our opinion. The only way this is going to change is with help from the outside.
Thank you very much. The chair has exhausted his time right now, and the chair now recognizes the ranking member for as much time as he may consume for the benefit of questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Rush. First, I want to compliment you, gentlemen, for your refreshing candor. We do have a new tradition here that we ask you to testify under oath, which has not normally been the case for an authorization subcommittee. But having said that, the testimony today is much more cogent than it was 4 years ago, and it's much more open about what the real reason the current bowl system exists, and it is money. When you're talking about market share and market dominance and all of that, and when Mr. Fox is talking about it's a week of events and how much money it brings to San Antonio, at least we're putting on the table why the current system is so entrenched. I do think that after today's hearing, we need to. I have a piece of advice for the BCS coordinating board. You should either change your name to BES for Bowl Exhibition System, or just drop the C and call it the BS system, because it's not about determining the championship on the field. I'm going to read some of Mr. Thompson's testimony, because to the average fan, this is the reason that people are so upset. His reason, Mr. Thompson's reason number 3, that the current system is flawed, is that the BCS is based on a flawed premise. Nearly half of the FBS teams are eliminated from the national championship before the season even begins. The current BCS system is based on a fundamentally flawed premise that computers and pollsters can look at 6 or 7 outstanding teams, all of whom have lost no more than one game, and few, if any, have ever played each other in that year, and decide which are the 2 best and should play in the national championship game. It's impossible to know which of those great teams are actually the best unless they play each other. Computers don't know, pollsters don't know, and the BCS surely doesn't know. Nearly half of the FBS teams are eliminated from the national championship even before the season begins. None of the 51 teams that play in the non-AQ conferences can, for all practical purposes, ever win a BCS national championship, given how the current system is constituted. These teams are, in effect, done before day one. A system that produces this result is patently unfair. I don't think that's a debatable proposition. Mr. Swofford, you are the head of the BCS. You're the point person. How do you answer that? That before the first game is even played, half the football teams in the country that play college football at Division 1A don't have a prayer to winning the national championship.
Well, I think the answer to that, Congressman Barton, is that the polls, and I know a lot of people, question the polls. They've been questioned forever and ever in college football. But the polls reflect what's happened on the field, and it reflects a mix of people's view from a national perspective. Each of the 11 conferences nominate potential pollsters for the Harris Poll, which is our newest poll.
Well, but that's how do you answer Mr. Bleimeier's in his testimony? In 2004, Boise State Broncos were undefeated and ranked 9th in the BCS. They were excluded, but Michigan at 13th and Pittsburgh at 21st got into a BCS game. In 2008, they were undefeated again, and they ended up ranked 9th in the BCS. Again, they were excluded. Ohio State Cincinnati and Virginia Tech, all ranked lower than Boise State, were in the BCS. The one year, 2006, they were undefeated. They did get invited to the BCS, and son of a gun, they beat Oklahoma in one of the most exciting college football games that I have ever watched. I mean, again, half the teams that start out don't have a prayer that they're going to get to play in that championship game, and even the best of the best. And I didn't realize how good Boise State was, but their record compares with any team in the country. They just happen to be in a small population state in a weak media market, and with all due respect, have the ugliest football field I have ever seen. I try to watch them, and it just hurts my eyes to watch that blue field. I mean, so.
Congressman, excuse me.
Yes, sir. Go ahead.
I didn't mean to interrupt you. As I said, the polls and how this is determined has been agreed upon by all 11 conferences.
But you
it's
yourself,
where we are today.
But you yourself said in response to Mr. Rush's question that these conference agreements are about money. It's about market share. It's not about athleticism on the field.
Well,
Mr. Bleymaier had pointed out that there are 88 NCAA schools, 88 NCAA championships. Those are determined on the field. The Division I-A college football isn't, and the difference is, with possibly the exception of basketball, none of the NCAA sports make any money. Football does. Division I-A football does, and I understand that a conference affiliation at a Big 12, where my school is, Texas A&M's got an athletic budget. I don't know what it is, but I bet it's $30-40 million a year. Mm-hmm. So I'm glad that they have it. I'm glad that they do it. I'm glad they're part of the Big 12. But even in Division I-A, you could have a playoff system, make just as much money, but you would have the added benefit that the championship would be determined on the field.
I have a little differing view of whether it's determined on the field. In my earlier remarks, I talked about the regular season and the importance of the regular season and the fact that, and I don't think anybody would argue this point, that college football has the best regular season in all of sports. And the reason that is because that's our playoff.
Why do you keep adding games to the regular season?
Every day of the regular season is a part of that playoff. Every game matters. We've got a situation now where if you're in Texas, you're probably concerned about what's going on the West Coast or in the Southeastern Conference or the Atlantic Coast Conference, because what happens in those games may well impact what happens in the Big 12, for instance. So every game is basically a playoff during the regular season in college football.
If that's your argument, then you should have. You shouldn't have but one or two non-conference games, and you shouldn't be adding regular season games. You should also have the championship game between the South and the North, or the East and the West divisions of your power conferences. That game ought to mean something. It doesn't. I think one of you testified, or at least we read some testimony, that attendance is down at these so-called conference championship games, because they don't mean anything.
Well, actually they do, because if you win those games, you go on. That's the automatic qualifier from that conference into the BCS game.
So why was attendance down in the ACC championship game last year? If it means so much.
That's a good question, and we'd like to get it back up, and I think we will. It may have been the matchup in the state of Florida. It might have been geographic, might have been related to the economy.
Let me ask a few more questions about the BCS. It is a voluntary organization. I would assume it is chartered as a corporation. Is that right or wrong?
No.
It's not chartered.
No.
It's an operation. It has a governing board, and there are 8 votes on the governing board. Is that right?
At the presidential level, yes, sir.
Okay.
There are 11 at the commissioner's
And
level.
Mr. Bleymaier pointed out that the 6 power conferences each have 1 vote. I understand that. The other 51 schools, unfortunately, combined get 1 vote. I don't understand that. And Notre Dame gets a vote. Why does Notre Dame get a vote?
Well, again, because of their history and tradition and the role they have in college football historically and presently.
Well, why, okay.
And
why wouldn't USC get their own vote?
They're a conference member. They
Or
have,
Oklahoma.
They have a vote through the
Or
Pac-10.
Alabama.
They each
Or
have
Ohio
a vote.
State. Or
They-
Penn State. They've got storied college programs.
Notre Dame is an independent.
Is it because Notre Dame has its own national contract for televising college football?
No, I don't think it's specific.
That doesn't have
because-
anything to do with it?
Because of that, I think it's because of the place that they have in the tradition and history of college football. And if they weren't involved in the BCS and qualified, for instance, for the national championship game,
Using
that
that
certainly
logic,
would undermine the current system.
using that logic, Delaware, which is the first state in the nation, ought to have 50 votes in the House because of their tradition, and they were the first one to ratify the Constitution, the first state. I mean, that doesn't make a lot of sense to me. The money that the BCS gets for their football television contract, where does that actually go? I mean, you have a bank account in New York, Chicago. Does it go to each of the conferences directly, or does it go to a central repository financial institution then is distributed?
It goes to a central escrow account, which is then distributed back out to the various conferences.
Who controls that?
The conference that is the coordinating conference.
So that rotates?
It rotates, yes, sir.
Is there an audit committee?
Yes.
Are
Audited.
those audits publicly available?
Yes.
They are publicly available. Okay. Does the BCS as a legal entity make a profit?
No. It goes to the institutions and conferences.
So the BCS as a repository is purely a contractual legal entity, and the money flows through that to the member conferences, and then the member conference distributes it to the members of their conference. And if you're an independent, depending on where you rank in the hierarchy, you would get directly from the central repository. Is that right?
It's a pass-through, yes, sir.
Okay. Does Notre Dame get a disproportionate share because they have 1 vote?
Notre
Or
Dame.
do they get more than Boise State, or they get more than Ohio State because they seem to be in and of themselves?
Notre Dame receives, if they do not play in a BCS game, a 1/66th share, which is basically the equivalent of what they might receive if they were a member of one of the six.
But if they do
AQ
play, then they
conferences.
get the $18 million. Is that right?
No, they receive $4.5 million if
They
they
don't
do
get the-
participate in the game. Yes, sir.
Okay.
One thing, sir, could I clarify
Sure.
one point? In terms of looking at the revenue distribution, the other way to look at it is the 10 teams that play in the 5 BCS games each receive the same amount of money, regardless of which conference you're coming from.
That's another point. Each member conference gets this $18 million, which they distribute as they see fit within their conference.
Correct.
Now, the team that actually plays in the BCS game, the Orange Bowl or the Sugar Bowl or whatever, do they get, in addition to their share of that $18 million, do they get $10 to $15 million for actually playing in the game?
No, sir. It's up to the conferences how each conference is probably a little different, but each conference distributes its money to its membership
like
in the way it chooses.
Alamo payoff to each team is how much?
$5 million.
2.25. Each team gets 2.25 million. The Fort Worth Bowl, each team gets 525,000. But like the big BCS bowls, each team gets like 15 or 16 million dollars. Isn't that right?
18.
18. Okay. Now that 18 million, in addition to the other 18 million, the second 18 million, the participating team also has to share that with its conference members.
There are not two 18 millions.
Oh, they're not.
There's one 18 million.
I'm confused.
Let's say, I'm sorry.
But go back to my Alamo Bowl friend. You give to each participating team $2.25 million, right?
Yeah,
to the team. They go to the team. That doesn't go to the BCS. That goes to the team.
It goes to the conferences, and then they have a revenue distribution.
Goes to the conferences.
Right.
Yeah. But the Orange Bowl gives each participating team $18 million. Is that right?
They give each conference $18 million.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
So when Mr. Rush was talking about the 18, that money comes from the bowl
right
to the conference, and there's not an additional amount of money that goes to the team that actually plays in that game.
That's correct.
So it is technically possible that at the bowl level that Mr. Fox is, a team could actually lose money going to his bowl because he doesn't get $2.25 million. He gets his share of that. And if he takes 100 football players and 20 cheerleaders and 200 band members and the athletic department and whoever else gets to tag along, it could actually cost the school money to go play in his bowl. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's a fair assessment, and I think that's incumbent upon the current system that we need to make those business decisions to see if it makes sense. I know in our case, I don't think any of the teams have ever lost.
Mr. Chairman, I've got a lot more questions, but Mr. Green has been very patient. I'm going to suspend, let Mr. Green ask some questions, and then I would ask unanimous consent that you could come back to me.
There'll be a second round, Mr. Chairman. There'll be a second round.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, we all represent as alumni from our individual schools, and I'll remind my colleagues from Texas A&M that it took years for the University of Houston, which is a very urban university, to get into the Southwest Conference, and after we were winning it enough, the Southwest Conference was destroyed, in which impacted
that was the problem. We just wanted you in the conference. We didn't want you to win any games.
That's right. I understand that. But when we were winning, then all of a sudden the Southwest Conference became no more, and that impacted a number of the schools, including large urban universities. You're not in a big conference. You're recruiting. Obviously, the invitation to the bowl game, and it comes down to the money. Mr. Swofford, you're the commissioner of the Atlantic Conference, the ACC, which in recent years hasn't been what powerhouse football, college football. Last year, the ACC's conference champion was Virginia Tech, which was ranked 19 in BCS standings. Two conferences whose champions did not automatically qualify for BCS bowl games have much better records than ACC teams last year. The Mountain West Conference that had three teams that finished in front of Virginia Tech, University of Utah, Texas Christian University, and Brigham Young University, while the Western Atlantic Conference, the WAC, had one team, Boise State University. Despite the disparity in team records, the ACC received $18 million in guaranteed BCS money for its schools, while the Mountain West and the WAC each received $3.8 million. Why should the ACC conference be guaranteed so much as compared to the Mountain West and the WAC? And again, the University of Houston is not a member of either of those conferences. So.
Congressman, I think it goes back to what I said earlier in terms of the marketplace and how the BCS came together, and the ACC's market value at the time, which has probably only been enhanced with the addition of Miami and Virginia Tech and Boston College. So, and I think you would say the same thing about about the other conferences that are automatic qualifiers. You can always take 1 year in the standings and say this, that, or the other. The previous year, the ACC champion again was Virginia Tech, and they were ranked number 3 in the BCS standings. So, there are three schools in our league that have played in the national championship game, some on multiple occasions. So, you can take any 1 year and it looks good or doesn't look as good in terms of various conferences champions.
Okay. I know that interconference records of Mountain West actually had a better percentage in college football in 07 and 08 with a 55% win rate against teams in the automatic conferences, while the Southeastern Conference, the SEC, had only a 45% winning percentage. Does the BCS have some type of leveling that looks at not just 1 year or 2 years, but looks at over a period of time, that the winningness of different conferences, is that part of the BCS standards?
Yes, sir. The automatic qualifying standards are based on 4-year cycles.
Okay. Another question, Mississippi. During the regular season, your key argument for the BCS is that it makes college football regular season exciting and relevant. You cite college basketball and note that fans don't pay attention to regular season until March Madness in the NCAA tournament. Do television networks have a broadcast that broadcasts the regular season games have a vested interest in the BCS in order to keep the ratings for the regular season games high? In your contract negotiations, does Fox and ESPN retain? Did the Fox and ESPN retain the BCS? In other words, is that one of the reasons why the season record is important? That so that to keep the ratings up during the regular season?
Well, I don't think Fox or ESPN, when we have television negotiations with those entities, which we had last fall, they did not try to be a player in the structure of postseason. I think, obviously they are interested in the regular season being as strong as it can be, but they have not had a role in determining what the postseason would be at all.
I would just give a contrast. The NFL, which has a playoff program, it doesn't seem like their regular season suffers because they have a playoff system. Why is football different? Or college football different?
Well, I think it relates to the fact that since we don't have a playoff, every game in the regular season is critically important in terms of the postseason and whether you will qualify for the national championship game or a BCS game, or as you move into the later stages of a season, sir, a team might know it's not going to be in a BCS game or the national championship game, but those last 3 or 4 or 5 games, they have something to play for if there's a bowl and an opportunity to compete in a bowl. So I think the bowl system as a whole, not just the BCS system, contributes to how valuable the regular season is and how interesting and fun that it is for the players and fans.
Mr. Chairman, you've been real gracious. I have one more question of Mr. Fox. And coming from Houston with what you would call one of the smaller bowls, and I know, although ours is smaller than the Alamo, you claim that smaller bowls, the Bowl Association would suffer if college football adopts a playoff system. And I appreciate the economic impact for those games on the host communities. However, I don't see why a 7-game playoff system with 8 teams is any more detrimental than the Bowl Association, than the BCS, which is a 5-game with 10 teams. Either way, the vast majority of the bowl games are basically exhibition, and they've always have been.
Well, to address that, obviously there's a number of different models being put forward as far as a playoff is concerned. But anytime you go to a playoff format, you're automatically distinguishing basically an NCAA tournament versus an NIT tournament, if they exist at all. Right now, the NIT is subsidized by the NCAA to provide those opportunities. In the bowl system, it's the communities that are stepping forward to underwrite those opportunities. And if you look at, I think a point to go back to on the conference championship games is a good point. Why are they down? Obviously somewhat economic related in this recent state of the economy. But also you have a 1-week turnaround under most situations where teams don't know they've qualified for a championship game until 1 week out. Well, their fans on a 1-week turnaround in a tough, challenging economy are going to have a tougher decision whether to go to that destination. I know we hosted the championship game, the Big 12 championship game in San Antonio 2 years ago. We had number 1 Missouri versus number 8 Oklahoma. Arguably, both teams in our footprint should be an easy sellout, correct? We didn't. We sold 60 to 65,000. Missouri's number 1. If they win that championship game, they're going on the national championship game. So there's always that next game that the fans have a chance to wait and hold out for the next game. The same could be said with the playoff. Are they going to travel 15,000 strong on 4 successive weeks? I doubt it.
Okay, last thing. What if we had a rotating, for example, the Alamo Bowl would rotate into the playoff system, where you would have a rotating bowl system? I don't know if that's even ever been considered by BCS.
That's effectively what the BCS is now. Is you have 5 games all rotating the championship game.
But it's not. You know, there are a lot of bowl games, but there's only a certain number that are allowed to be there. So, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The chair thanks the gentleman. The chair recognizes himself for some additional questions. Mr. Bleymaier, it's been stated earlier that one of the most exciting games in recent years was the 2007 Fiesta Bowl and your school, Boise State's dramatic defeat of Oklahoma, University of Oklahoma. Fine game, well coached, well played. The game has become an instant classic, and replays of the final drive were on sports highlights all over the place, repeatedly so. Can you comment on how big bowl games affect your school from an economic standpoint and also from a recruiting standpoint?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. That game was obviously one for the ages and put Boise State on a national stage equal to the longtime college football powers. You can't buy that kind of exposure. You can't buy that kind of prestige. Our enrollment applications at the university skyrocketed within a week of the Fiesta Bowl victory. So that exposure, like I said, is priceless. In addition, with our revenue split through the 5 conferences, the non-qualifying conferences, Boise State received $6 million that year. And, the conference received $6 million. Boise State received 70% of that, which was approximately $4.2 million. We've been to 9 bowl games in the last 10 years. That's the only year that we netted any revenue. It's been talked about that bulls make money, and some bowls do. But there are also probably around a dozen or so more that don't make any money at the end of the day. As Mr. Barton was talking about, when you factor in the expenses that the teams have and the requirements that the schools have to buy tickets. I'm involved in our bowl in Boise, and I can tell you, it may on paper look like there's money being made, but in reality, money is not being made. The conferences are subsidizing those bowl games. So the bowl system is great, and I support it, and we're glad we have one in Boise. I don't see how adding 2 more games in any way is going to negatively impact the bowl system. In fact, the bowl system continues to grow. When we created the Humanitarian Bowl in Boise, Idaho 12 years ago, I believe there were 20 bowl games. And we went to the committee and added another one, and there was talk at that time, there's too many bowls. We don't need any more bowls. Well, we were approved. I think that was 21 or 22. That continues. Now there's 34. And there's talk of creating more bowl games. So even if a playoff is not in the offing here, I predict there's going to be more bowl games in the future. Do I think that's necessary? No. Personally, 6 and 6 teams do not warrant going to a bowl game. As an athletic director at a school, I don't think we need to be rewarding student athletes for winning 6 games and losing 6 games, or for that matter, winning 7 games and losing 5 games. To me, a postseason experience, you ought to earn it on the playing field, and it ought to mean something. It ought to be special. I don't think having 6-6 teams in bowl games are special, and I don't think a playoff in any way will lessen the regular season. In fact, I think it will enhance regular season games. Right now, because there's only 2 teams that are going to play in that national championship, I think it hurts the regular season. Last year, when USC lost to Oregon State in September, basically they were out of it. So for USC, their season is over. That doesn't help with their remaining games on their schedule to bring interest or excitement into their communities. But by expanding this to more teams, that's going to enable more programs to remain involved and remain in the hunt for the gold ring at the end of the season. And that, in my opinion, is going to heighten interest in the regular season, totally contrary to what's been mentioned earlier.
Can you address how this affects your recruiting, knowing that you were under the current system that it's almost impossible to participate in the championship game?
Absolutely. Mr. Chairman, high school student athletes, they want to play on national television. They want to play for a national championship. And when you're going into homes and you're trying to woo a student to your university, if you don't have the opportunity, as good an opportunity or a fair and equitable opportunity at the start of the season as a number of other schools, those schools are going to use that against you in the recruiting process and say, why would you consider a Boise State? They're never going to play for a national championship. They were lucky to get into the Fiesta Bowl in 2006, and they probably won't qualify in the future. But if you come to our school, you're guaranteed as a automatic qualifying institution, regardless of what your record is, an opportunity to play in a BCS game. That's prestige, that's exposure, that's national television. It definitely hurts us in recruiting if we're not able to offer that same opportunity from day one that other schools do.
Thanks. The chair has exhausted his time. The chair now recognizes the ranking member, Mr. Barton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a unanimous consent request to put in the record 2 statements by Congressman Simpson of Idaho and Congressman Miller of California.
Hearing no objection. Hearing no objection, so ordered.
Okay, thank you. You'll be happy to know, Mr. Chairman, and our panelists, I have a plane to catch, so I'm not going to be quite as loquacious this round. I'm going to start off with Mr. Fox at the Alamo Bowl, and I'm not picking on you, Mr. Fox. You just happen to be representing the bowls that are not the major big bowls, and you're here. So this is not a knock on the Alamo Bowl. I love the Alamo Bowl. I like going to the Alamo Bowl. I've got relatives in San Antonio, and I really enjoy your city. The Alamo Bowl, like all these other bowls, is a nonprofit entity. Is that correct?
Correct.
And I would think most of the people that participate are volunteers.
Very much so.
Probably some paid people, just an executive director or somebody to manage it on a day-to-day basis and organize all these activities. But the majority of your folks are community citizens who just volunteer because it's fun and they like to help.
Absolutely. We've got a full-time staff of 6 and probably 500 volunteers.
Okay.
Really.
Now, you say that your money that you raise, your revenue source is the ticket sales. You don't get or do you also get some of the television money?
The primary funding streams for a bowl game really ticket sales, TV revenue, and sponsorships in general.
And general sponsorships. Okay. How much of that money, percentage-wise, actually flows through to the charity that you choose to raise money for?
But really, if you look at it, the biggest charity that we have are the 2 participating institutions. They're getting over 75% of that $2.25 million that I was talking about. That's the primary charity. After that, now we do some things in our local marketplace, scholarship programs to local high school seniors going to education, those type of things. But right off the top, you're at least 75%.
Okay. But that's going to the schools that I would quibble that a contribution or an allocation to the team that's participating is not a charity, but I'm not going to argue if that's the way college football defines itself, then I'm not going to argue that point today. How much of the money goes to classic charities, Boys and Girls Clubs, scholarships, underprivileged children, I don't know what else in San Antonio, or at least that you give not to the schools?
Yeah, we'll have another several $100,000 that'll go out to the local organizations, whether it's in Boys and Girls Clubs, whether it's the Kids Sports Network, whether you name it. There are a number of different organizations who benefit from the bowl as well. Besides the institutions, obviously that's the primary donor, if you will.
But I mean, the primary reason that your bowl and all the other bowls exist is to generate money for the local community, and you do pay expenses or pay a contribution to the schools that actually play the game.
Correct.
Which is a good thing. But you were pretty upfront that it was an event, it was a series of activities. You're trying to get people to come to San Antonio to have a good time and spend money.
Absolutely.
All right.
When you look at it, it's one.
And I'm good with that. I've gone to San Antonio and had a good time and spent money, so I'm okay with that. Now, why couldn't you do the same thing and be a part? The Alamo Bowl be a quarterfinal game or something like that. Why would that not? Why would fewer people come, spend less money, and you not be able to do all the good deeds that you do with the money you generate if it were a part of a playoff system?
Well, one of the challenges with the playoff system, quite honestly, is the fact you're having. It doesn't matter what format. Let's say your 16-game format. You've got 15 games. You've got 4 successive weeks. If in your original statement, when you talked about A&M and Texas Tech in San Antonio, would it sell out? Absolutely. But in a quarterfinal matchup, we might have the University of Washington.
And the Red Raiders would spend lots of money. Now, the Aggies are frugal. We probably wouldn't. But the Raiders, they'll spend money.
All teams are very generous from that perspective. But when you look at teams that are not in the geographic footprint, you come into a situation where you have a challenge of people traveling across the country. I brought up the issue, I think, when you stepped out about the Big 12 championship game. You brought up the question why championship game attendance is down. Obviously, economy is one of the issues right now, but also a one-week turnaround. When you have a championship game, teams often do not know where they're going until 1 week out. Those fans have to make the decision, do I commit to the championship game now in a week, or am I going to roll the dice? Do we win the championship game to go on to the BCS game or another bowl game,
if you're,
which is 3 or 4 weeks down the road?
With your current system, and I don't know exactly, but the Alamo Bowl gets like the number 6 team in the Big 12 and the number 6 team in the Big 10 or something?
Somewhere between 4 and 6, depending on how many teams are in the BCS.
Yeah, so there have been some years that you were getting teams that were 7-5, 6-6, but if you're part of a playoff system, you're probably going to get teams that are 9-2, 8-3, hot team on a roll. You may be getting Boise State, who's coming in undefeated, but not from a power conference. You know, it would seem to me that your actual product on the field in a playoff system is going to be a little bit. And my Aggies have been in your Alamo Bowl, so I'm not going to say the current product is bad. But Penn State was a lot better the year they played A&M in the Alamo Bowl. You'd probably be better off, wouldn't you? I mean, revenue-wise, I don't see how you'd.
Well, not necessarily, because you also could not be in that system. Keep in mind, if you go to a playoff, there is no question that the bowl system will be jeopardized.
But it depends on how many, and depends on what the BCS and the NCAA decide to do. You could have a playoff system with 64 teams and use every bowl that's currently in there. You could do that. You could have a playoff system where you had home field advantage to the higher-ranked team. You could have a playoff system where you took the I don't want to say the better bowls, but the more established bowls, and certainly the Alamo Bowl would be one, and then have the other bowls, which tend to be the smaller, newer bowls, could still do their bowl games, and you know, since most of the teams aren't going to get to play for the national championship anyway, those bowls would still do all the events that you're talking about. But if you're one of the playoff bowls, you're going to be a part of a system that your bowl may have the national championship team. It just has to win your game in the next 2 or whatever to make it.
Well, that's certainly part of a system that could be in place and could be discussed. Now, when you talk about a 64-team playoff, is what, 63 games? We'd still be playing.
Well, I mean, I'm not advocating that. Mr. Swofford, I've been real nice to you. I haven't asked a question this round. I can't let it go. You're the guy that's representing the BCS. What's the wisdom behind the original BCS took the four existing bowls? Well, way back when there were more bowls than that because the Cotton Bowl was part of the original BCS. But the last, until 3 years ago, you had the Rose Bowl, the Sugar Bowl, the Orange Bowl, and the Fiesta Bowl. And the championship game rotated each year. Then 3 years ago, all of a sudden, you had a BCS championship game in addition to those bowls. Why didn't you, if you're going to go to an extra game, why didn't you make that the +1 game and take the winner of the two highest-ranked BCS bowls and put them in a real championship game? Why did you just create another game that's just another bowl game?
Well, first of all, the idea you just expressed was discussed at that time. It was also discussed a year ago on behalf of the ACC and the SEC, and there was not enough support within the group to move that forward. I think really when you go back to the origin of what is now the 4 games plus the national championship game, which was added, as you said, for the past 3 years, and the double hosting model where that rotates to one of the 4 BCS bowls each year, and they host both their bowl game and then the national championship game. What that did was actually open up access.
Open up access.
So, yes, because it gives 2 more teams the opportunity to play
in a non-championship game.
In the BCS games, and it did not add a game for the 2 teams that are playing in the championship game. Okay. And that was important to some people.
Mr. Thompson,
additional
Mr.
game
Bleymaier,
be
does
added.
that make sense to you, what he just said?
Well, Mr. Chairman, yes, it does. It did provide more access because, remember, there are 6 automatic qualifying conferences. With 4 games, there's only 8 slots. So they are guaranteed 6 of the 8. So we only have 2 chances to get in.
But it didn't give you much better chance to get into the game.
Well, absolutely. Absolutely. This isn't really in reference to a national championship.
I
But
thought
adding
that's
a
the
5th
whole
game,
the whole point of the BCS, theoretically, although we now know it's money, but
Right.
at least to the fans, it's to pick the championship, which you so eloquently pointed out.
right. Well, and it was interesting, as Commissioner Swofford has mentioned, that this was discussed last year. It was discussed by the commissioners. It was never discussed with the athletic directors who were part of the BCS committee, which I found very curious. But to your point, it didn't do anything more for the national championship, but it did provide more access. And
it provides more money. It's one more game.
Right.
Another week out of classroom.
It didn't because there's not a playoff, so it just basically added another bowl game.
The week after all the other bowl games.
Most of the, if I may, sir, most of the second semesters have not started at the majority, large majority of our schools.
I'm just being sarcastic. I mean, that's one of the reasons that we don't have a playoff system theoretically, but we keep showing that that's really not the reason, because we keep adding regular season games. We keep playing Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays, and now the BCS has added another game in addition to the Big 4 Daddy Bowl games. Mr. Thompson, if you had a vote, would you add? I think you've added. You've put forward an actual playoff proposal, which they're going to review. But if your vote was the current system, or the 4 BCS bowls plus a playoff, the +1, how would you vote on that?
I would prefer our proposal with a playoff rather than a +1.
I'm with you. But if you weren't given that vote, I mean, we've got them at least talking about a +1 system. I would hope you would prefer that over the current system.
I agree with Commissioner Swofford and Mr. Bleymaier that certainly the BCS format now has increased access. It, in essence, has created 2 additional spots, not for the national championship, but it has created 2 additional spots.
Okay.
So to answer your question directly, playoff, but if that's not an option, would you prefer the +1? Certainly, that is something that should get strong consideration, continued consideration, as all proposals.
Mr. Chairman, this is my last question, and I have to run to the airport. If we move our bill and the president signs it, and I feel very confident that if Chairman Rush and Chairman Waxman want to move the bill, that they're going to be successful. And I think Senator Hatch and other senators are going to be successful in the Senate if they choose to move forward. So let's say that our bill that's currently before this subcommittee becomes law, that you can't advertise the BCS as a national championship game because it would be a violation of the Federal Trade Act. Would you still do the BCS, or would you actually change and go to a playoff, Ms. Swofford? Because you don't have to change our bill doesn't say you have to change the BCS. It just says you can't advertise it as a national championship series.
Congressman, I don't know the answer to that. It hasn't been discussed at any level in direct reference to the bill, and you know, I'm not a lawyer. I can't really speak in that sense. So I think that's something that would have to be discussed. I would think
Well, I would encourage you to start discussing it, because I think there is better than a 50% chance if we don't see some action in the next 2 months on a voluntary switch to a playoff system that you will see this bill move. So it needs to be something that you need to start discussing. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, gentlemen. I have appreciated your testimony. It is enlightening, and while I don't agree with all of it, it is certainly honest and sincere, and I appreciate you being here. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The chair thanks the gentleman, and the chair wants to just commend the gentleman as he leads for his extraordinary work. I just have one question. It seems to me that the issue right here is the fact that we have a national championship series that's not really a national championship series, and that the reason why for the legislation, the reason why the involvement of Congress is that it's being advertised as a national championship series. And we think that although this has a title, it's really a misnomer. The title is a very empty title because of the process and the procedure of selecting the national championship. And it seems to me that there might be, under the current law, that there might be some fraudulent practices here, and that's the reason why we're there. Is this a meaningful title, the national championship title? Is this a meaningful title in your opinion, Mr. Swofford?
yes, I think it is. If you look at the level to which college football teams aspire to be in the BCS national champion, yes, I think it is.
Okay, Mr. Thompson?
Well, based on the ranking system, which I feel are confusing the computers and polls, yes, because as Mr. Swofford said previously, it has, in their opinion, the polls and the BCS rankings said these are the 1 and 2 ranked teams.
Okay, but now, is there any other way of looking at that? And is there any other bona fide, a better way of selecting the national championship?
Oh, I feel there is.
Okay. Mr. Fox?
I think if the numbers speak for themselves. If the BCS has been in existence for 11 years and had a 1 versus 2 matchup, and only 9 times before that was able to happen, I think it's allowed that system to take place.
And Mr. Bleymaier?
Well, I think that the national championship ought to be decided on the field, like the other 88 NCAA championships are.
The chair certainly thanks all the witnesses and for your time and also for your forthrightness, for your participation. We want to let the record reflect that there will be an additional 48 hours, additional 7 days for any additional questions that might be presented to the witnesses via writing, in writing, and we would ask that you respond within another 7 days if there are, in fact, any additional questions. And lastly, the chair entertains unanimous consent request to enter into the record the statement of Mr. Neil Abercrombie of Hawaii, and hearing no objection is so ordered. The chair now concludes this meeting. The hearing today is now adjourned. Thank you.